This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. After a night with his mistress, the mafia boss came home at dawn. His wife and newborn son were gone. At 5:17 a.m., Vittorio Kane pressed his thumb to the penthouse biometric pad and stepped inside his own home like a man who owned everything because he did. The marble foyer was dark. He loosened to Anasta, already composing the excuse he'd give Elena about the late meeting. He walked past the kitchen, stopped. On the island sat a USB drive and a folded note in Elena's handwriting. By the time you read this, we're gone. Vittorio didn't move for 4 full seconds. Then he walked to the nursery. The crib was empty. The small white blanket his son had slept under every night since coming home from the hospital gone. He opened Elena's closet. Bare hangers. He stood there in the silence of a penthouse worth $4 million, surrounded by everything money could buy, and understood with cold, absolute certainty that the one thing he believed he could never lose had already walked out the door. Before we go further, if you're watching this and you've ever felt like someone you trusted was living a completely different life right under your nose, hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the end. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one hits different, smash that like button. We've got more stories coming that you do not want to miss. Now, let's go back to where this really started. 6 months before that morning, Elena Moretti had not yet learned that the man she married kept the way other men keep 2 phones, one for the world to see, and one he protected with everything he had. She had met Vittorio Kane at a fundraising gala in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of event where the champagne cost more per glass than most people's hourly wage, and nobody talked about where their money actually came from. Elena had been there as a guest of the hospital, where she worked a labor and delivery nurse with 12 years of experience and exactly one formal dress she'd worn to 3 different occasions. She hadn't been looking for anyone. She'd been standing near the back bar, exhausted from a double shift she'd come straight from, holding a sparkling water and trying to look like she belonged. Vittorio had found her anyway. He was 44 to her 31. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the kind of stillness that powerful men develop when they've spent enough years never needing to raise their voice. He'd introduced himself without his last name at first, which she'd thought was strange but also oddly refreshing, in a room full of people whose business cards led with their net worth. "You're not drinking," he said. "I worked a 16-hour shift before coming here," she said. "If I have a drink, you'll find me asleep behind that pillar in 20 minutes. He'd smiled at that. A real one, not the performed kind she'd been watching all night. "What do you do?" "I'm a nurse, labor and delivery." "How'd you know?" "You've got that look. Like you've seen things that would make half the people in this room faint, and you're choosing not to talk about it tonight." She had laughed, genuinely. And that had been the beginning of something she would spend the next 2 trying to understand how a man so deeply embedded in darkness could present himself as the safest place she'd ever stood. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. She knew in the general way that people who live in New York long enough come to know things, that Vittorio Kane was connected. That was the word people used, connected. It was the word people used when they didn't want to say the other word. She had asked him once directly, sitting across from him at a small restaurant in the West Village, not the kind of place he usually chose. "Tell me the truth about what you do." He had held her gaze for a moment, then said, "I run businesses. Some of those businesses exist in spaces where the law is more of a suggestion than a rule. I have never harmed an innocent person. I have never done anything that would put you in danger. That's the truth I can offer you." It wasn't a full answer. She knew that, but she had believed the part about her safety, and she had believed in the particular way that intelligent people sometimes believe things they shouldn't, that her presence in his life might slowly pull him toward something cleaner. She had been wrong. Not about all of it, but about enough. They married quietly, a small ceremony at his estate in Westchester. 30 people, no press. Elena wore her mother's pearl earrings and carried white peonies. Vittorio cried during the vows, which surprised everyone in the room, including himself. For the first 8 months of the marriage, she had been genuinely happy. She had moved into the Manhattan penthouse, a 1,500 square foot apartment on the 42nd floor with a view of Central Park that still took her breath away some mornings. She had continued working 3 shifts a week at the hospital, which Vittorio supported without question. He was attentive, affectionate, occasionally overbearing in the way of men who love hard and control harder, but present. He came home for dinner. He called when he was running late. He remembered small things, the way she took her coffee, the name of the difficult supervisor she vented about, the anniversary of her mother's death. She got pregnant 7 months into the marriage, and that was when things began to shift in ways she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was small. He started coming home later. Stopped asking about her days with the same interest. When she mentioned feeling lonely, he responded with practical solutions: a housekeeper, a personal driver, credit card with no limit, as if loneliness were a logistical problem rather than an emotional one. She tried to talk to him about it 3 different times in 3 different ways, and each time walked away from the conversations, feeling like she'd been patted on the head and redirected. By her 5th month, the nights he didn't come home at all had become regular enough that she stopped asking for explanations. She told herself it was stress, that men like Vittorio carried weight she couldn't fully understand, that the baby would bring them back together. She told herself a lot of things in those months, the way women in difficult marriages develop an internal narrator who specializes in reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior. Then came the gala. It was a charity event, cancer research, black tie, held at the plaza. Vittorio had asked her to come, which she'd read as a good sign. She was 7 months pregnant, wearing a deep navy gown that her friend had helped her alter to accommodate the bump, and she had spent the evening feeling conspicuously out of place among the thin, immaculate women in Vittorio's orbit. She had stepped away from the table to use the restroom and was returning through the edge of the ballroom when she saw him. Vittorio was standing near a column at the far end of the room, partially obscured by a marble pillar and a large floral arrangement. He was talking to a woman. That part wasn't remarkable. The way he was talking to her was. The woman was perhaps 38, elegant in a way that read as completely effortless dark red dress, dark hair swept back, the kind of bone structure that photographs well from every angle. She was saying something low, tilted toward him, and Vittorio had his hand at the small of her back. Not a greeting, not a polite social gesture. The proprietary practiced ease of a man touching someone he touched regularly. Elena stopped walking. The woman laughed at something Vittorio said and rested her hand briefly in his chest, and Vittorio glanced around the room with the automatic caution of someone checking whether they'd been seen. He didn't see Elena. She stood there for 6 seconds, she counted them later, strange as that was, and then she turned and walked to the coat check, retrieved her wrap, and sat in the car outside for 40 minutes, until Vittorio came looking for her, at which point she told him she'd had a headache and needed air. He believed her, or he pretended to. She was no longer sure there was a difference. She never asked him who the woman was that night. She wasn't ready for the answer. 3 weeks later, Elena went into premature labor at 34 weeks. She had been at the hospital, finishing a shift her last before maternity leave when the contractions started. Not Braxton Hicks, real ones, coming in waves she recognized from the other side of the bed. She called Vittorio twice. Both calls went to voicemail. She called his assistant, who said he was in a meeting and would call back. She texted, "I'm in labor. I need you to come." She was 3 centimeters dilated before he arrived. Their son was born at 4:08 a.m. after 6 hours of labor, during which Vittorio had been present for approximately 40 minutes total, having stepped out twice to take calls. The baby was small, 4 pounds, 11 ounces, and spent his first 9 days in the NICU. Asina sat beside Isolette every day for 8 to 12 hours, learning the sound of the monitors, talking to her son in a low voice, telling him about things she planned to show him someday. Central Park in October. The way the Hudson looked at sunset from the Jersey side. The hospital where she worked, which he might someday walk past without ever knowing she'd once brought a dozen lives into the world within its walls. Vittorio visited the NICU 4 times in 9 days. He had reasons each time. She didn't argue with any of them. They brought the baby home on a Tuesday. Elena named him Marco, which Vittorio had agreed to, without strong feeling in either direction. The penthouse had been prepared, nursery fully decorated, night nurse hired, every practical necessity in place. Vittorio had handled all of it by phone, which was the version of involvement he was most comfortable with. The first week home, Elena was running on 3 hours of sleep a night. Marco was a small, fierce baby who nursed every 2 hours and screamed with the full-body commitment of someone genuinely outraged by the world. Elena managed it alone most nights while Vittorio slept in the guest room so he could be functional for meetings. She didn't fight that arrangement. She was too tired and too focused on keeping a 4-pound baby fed and warm and breathing steadily. But she noticed things. She noticed that Vittorio never once got up in the night. That he came home some evenings smelling of something she couldn't quite identify, a perfume, faint, not her own. That when she was nursing Marco in the living room at midnight and Vittorio walked through to get water, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not warmth, not guilt, something more like assessment, like he was calculating something. She started paying attention in a different way after that. It was a Wednesday night, 6 weeks after Marco came home, that Elena found the laptop. Vittorio had a home office he kept locked. She'd grown accustomed to that, had never made a significant issue of it. But that night, he'd left in a hurry to deal with something and had left the office door ajar. She walked past it on her way to the kitchen and saw the laptop on the desk, open, the screen still lit. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She went in. She told herself she was just checking his calendar. That was the lie she gave herself to cross the threshold. She told herself she'd look at his calendar, see if he had anything that explained the pattern of late nights, and then she'd close the laptop, and they'd talk about it in the morning like adults. She opened the email first, the name she didn't recognize, S. Vale. Dozens of threads, going back 14 months. She opened one at random. Read it opened another. And another. She sat down in his chair without meaning to, and she read for 45 minutes while Marco slept, and the city glittered 42 floors below her. And, by the end of those 45 minutes, she was no longer the person who had walked through that door. Serena Vale, that was her name. The woman from the gala. Elena understood immediately, the dark red dress, the hand on his chest, the ease of it. The emails were explicit enough in their affection to remove all ambiguity, and they were frequent enough to reveal a sustained, deliberate relationship that had begun several months before Elena got pregnant. But that was not the worst thing she found. In a folder labeled with a string of numbers she opened on instinct, she found documents. Legal documents, preliminary, not filed, but clearly drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A custody strategy, organized into sections. Elena's name appeared throughout, attached to language she could barely process, emotional instability, postpartum psychological deterioration, documented erratic behavior, unfit primary caregiver. There were notes from what appeared to be a private investigator, documenting her movements over the previous 2 months. There was a section outlining how Vittorio's legal team intended to establish him as the stable, financially capable primary parent, and Elena as a woman whose mental health made her unsuitable to raise her own child. She sat with that document for a long time. Then she stood, crossed to the printer, and copied everything. She returned the laptop to exactly the position she'd found it. She walked to the nursery. She stood over Marco's crib and watched him breathe those small, rapid, utterly trustful breaths of a baby who has no idea what kind of world he's been born into. And she made herself a promise that she did not speak aloud, but felt in her chest with the force of something structural, something that would not give way. She was not going to let Vittorio Kane take her son. She was not going to let him paint her as unstable and hand her child to himself and whatever version of Serena Vale he was planning to install in her place. She was not going to disappear quietly into a legal process that his money would shape from the beginning. She was going to get out, and she was going to take Marco with her. But she needed help, and she needed to be careful in a way she had never had to be careful before, because the man she was married to had spent 20 years building a network of surveillance, leverage, and controlled information, and if he suspected for even a moment that she was planning to leave, she understood with cold clarity that she would lose any advantage she currently had. She called Nicholas Reeve the next morning while Vittorio was in the shower. Nicholas was a civil attorney she'd known for 3 years, though their connection was not professional. 18 months earlier, Elena had been the nurse on duty in the ER waiting area when Nicholas had collapsed a cardiac event that had initially been misread by the intake staff as anxiety. Elena had been the one who had pulled a physician into the hallway and said, with the specific kind of quiet force that experienced nurses develop, Something is wrong with this man. Look at him again. They had caught it in time. Nicholas had spent 4 days in the hospital and had never forgotten who had been paying attention. When she said quietly, with the bathroom fan still running 30 feet away, "I need help and I can't explain everything right now," he didn't ask a lot of questions. "Can you get out of the apartment today?" "This afternoon." "I have a pediatric appointment for Marco at 2. Come to my office after." "I'll clear my afternoon." She told him everything in 2 hours. Sitting across from him in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown, Marco asleep and his carrier on the chair beside her. She had the printed documents in a folder she'd kept in her work bag. She watched Nicholas read through them, his face doing the careful, controlled thing that good lawyers' faces do when they're processing information they're not going to react to until they've finished. When he looked up, he said he hasn't filed any of this yet. "No," which means right now, you're not in a reactive position. You're in a preventative one. That's different. He set the folder down. "Elena, I want you to understand what you're dealing with. This isn't a difficult divorce. This is a custody fight that a man with significant criminal resources is planning to initiate on his terms. He's been building a case against you. If you wait for him to file, you're fighting from behind." "I know. What do you want to do?" She looked at Marco, still sleeping. "I want to leave. Completely. I want to take Marco somewhere safe and figure out the legal piece from a position where Vittorio can't just reach in and control the environment." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know someone. Her name is Clara Rourke. She runs a private network, discreet relocation, protective housing, documentation support for people in exactly this kind of situation. I'm going to call her today. Is she safe? She's the reason 3 women I know of are alive right now." He paused. "That's not hyperbole. Clara Rourke was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s who arrived at Nicholas's office 2 days later with a leather notebook and no excess warmth. She wasn't unkind, just efficient, the way people who deal with genuine danger tend to become. She sat across from Elena and asked questions in a specific order that made Elena understand she had done this many times before. How many staff does he employ in the building? Who monitors the building cameras? What is his typical schedule on weekdays? Who among your contacts does he know about? Do you have a car registered in your name? What bank accounts are in your name alone? What documents do you have original access to? Passport, birth certificate for the child, Marco's medical records?" Elena answered everything. Some answers were better than others. "The building cameras are managed by his head of security, a man named Dario. He reports directly to Vittorio," Elena said, "which means if I try to leave through the main lobby with luggage, Dario will know before I reach the street." Clara wrote something in her notebook. "You won't leave with luggage. You'll leave with a diaper bag. Everything else goes before you do, in small pieces, over 2 weeks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that reads as preparation." She looked up. "You're a nurse. You've managed high-stress situations with limited resources and high consequences for error." "Yes, good, because that's what the next 2 weeks are going to feel like." Clara set her pen down. "I need you to understand something clearly. Once you leave, there is no coming back to retrieve things you forgot. There is no calling from the road to talk it through. Once you're in the car, you're in it until we have you somewhere Vittorio Kane cannot reach without a court order. Are we clear? We're clear. One more thing." Clara looked at her steadily. "Is there anyone in your life currently, any friend, colleague, family member, who might mention to Vittorio that you've been distressed? Anyone who might not understand the seriousness of what you're doing and say the wrong thing to the wrong person?" Elena thought for a moment. Then she thought of Vivian. Dr. Vivian Hart was 61 and had been Elena's mentor during her first years as a nurse, back when Elena had been 23 and terrified, and Vivian had been the kind of senior physician who made time for terrified young nurses because she remembered being one herself. They had maintained a friendship across the years even after Vivian moved to a different hospital system, occasional dinners, phone calls, the kind of friendship that deepens slowly rather than dramatically. Elena called her that evening and asked if they could meet. They sat at Vivian's kitchen table, which was covered in medical journals and coffee cups, and the organized chaos of a woman who had filled every corner of her life with work and intention. Elena told her, not everything just enough, the affair. The custody documents, the plan to leave. Vivian listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a long moment. "I was married to a man like that," she said finally. Not mafia, but powerful. The kind of man who believes that the fact that he loves you is sufficient justification for whatever he does to control you. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I stayed 4 years longer than I should have because I kept thinking I could outlast it. That if I was patient enough and careful enough and good enough, the man I'd thought I was marrying would eventually reappear. She paused. He didn't. What did you do? I left on a Tuesday. I told no one beforehand. I didn't take much. She looked at Elena, and I have never once in 15 years regretted it. Elena drove home that night with Marco in the back seat and her hands steady on the wheel, thinking about the word Tuesday and about the way Vivian had said it not like a memory, but like a fact that had eventually become a foundation. She began preparing. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular texture of controlled terror, the kind where every moment had to appear completely normal, while underneath, everything was moving. She began removing things in the smallest possible increments. A few pieces of Marco's clothing tucked into her work bag. His medical records, copied and placed in a waterproof folder she kept at the hospital. Her own passport and documents, retrieved from the home safe during a window when the building's secondary camera in the hallway was under a maintenance cycle that Vittorio's security team had mentioned to her in passing. She had filed that detail away. Without knowing why, and now she was grateful for it. She opened a bank account at a branch 12 blocks from the hospital, using a lunch break, paid for in cash. Nicholas had helped her identify the financial assets that were legally hers and untangled from Vittorio's larger holdings. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough. She was careful with her phone. She and Nicholas communicated through a secondary device she kept at the hospital locker. She never contacted Clara directly. She never searched anything on the home network that might create a searchable trail. She kept making Vittorio's coffee in the mornings. She kept going to bed at the same time. She kept the apartment exactly as it always was. But Vittorio was noticing something. She could feel it. Not in what he said almost nothing different, but in the way he watched her sometimes across the kitchen. A small measuring quality had entered his attention, the way a man who monitors people for a living eventually turns that skill on everyone in his proximity. She smiled when she felt him watching. She talked about Marco's weight gain and the sleep schedule and the pediatrician's recommendation about tummy time. She gave him nothing that looked like a woman who was planning to disappear. Then, 4 days before she planned to leave, Serena Vale appeared at the hospital. Elena was coming off a shift when she saw her near the main entrance, by the information desk, wearing a gray coat and looking at her phone. The moment Serena looked up and their eyes met, Elena understood it was not a coincidence. The recognition between them was immediate and wordless, the mutual acknowledgement of two women who knew exactly who the other was. Serena walked toward her. Elena did not move. "I'm not here to fight with you," Serena said. Her voice was low and careful. "I came because there's something you need to know." Elena waited. "Vittorio knows something is different with you. He hasn't said it to me directly, but I know how he operates." Serena's jaw was tight. "He's been talking to his attorney about accelerating the timeline." Elena kept her expression level. "What timeline? The custody thing." Serena looked away for a moment, then back. "I didn't know about that until 2 weeks ago. What he was planning to do to you, I didn't know the details." Something crossed her face that looked close to shame, though Elena was not inclined to examine it generously. "I'm telling you because I'm not willing to be part of that." Elena said nothing for a moment. "Then why are you telling me this?" "Because whatever I am to Vittorio, I'm not the kind of person who helps a man take someone's child." Elena held her gaze for a long count. Then she said, "If you mean that, don't contact me again. Don't do anything. Just stay out of the way." She walked to her car and sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes, breathing steadily before she drove home. That night, after Vittorio fell asleep, she checked the hidden folder on the copy drive she'd made. The custody documents, the financial records, the photographs. All of it intact, all of it real. She made her decision. She wasn't waiting 4 more days. She was leaving in the morning. She sat in the nursery in the dark, Marco breathing softly in his crib, and she thought about everything she was about to do, and everything she was about to lose, and everything she refused to let Vittorio Kane take from her. Then she stopped thinking and started making a list. By 2 a.m. she was ready. By 4 a.m., Vittorio had left the penthouse for what he thought was a meeting. By 5:17 a.m., he would return to find her gone. But right now, in the dark, Elena sat beside her son's crib, with her hand resting lightly on the mattress, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and waited for the moment she could finally move. The small white blanket her grandmother had made, the one Elena had brought from her childhood home, the one she'd laid over Marco every night since they brought him home from the NICU, was folded at the foot of the crib. And she picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she placed it carefully in the diaper bag. She was not leaving everything behind. Some things she was taking with her. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. The SUV was a black Suburban with tinted windows and a dent above the rear wheel well that Clara had told Elena to look for specifically, because in a city full of black Suburbans, you needed something to distinguish the one that was there for you from the ones that weren't. Elena saw it from half a block away. She walked at a pace that wasn't hurried. That was the instruction Clara had given her. Don't walk fast. Don't look back. Don't do anything that reads as a woman running away, because cameras are everywhere, and Vittorio's people know what running looks like. So she walked the way she walked to the subway on a Tuesday morning shift, Marco strapped to her chest in the carrier, the diaper bag on her shoulder, and inside that diaper bag, 2 changes of clothes for Marco, his medical records, her passport, both their birth certificates, the copy drive with everything she'd taken from Vittorio's laptop, $4,000 in cash, and her grandmother's folded blanket tucked along the side. She had left her phone on the kitchen counter. That had been Clara's instruction, too. The phone stays. They'll ping it the moment they realize you're gone, and if it's in your pocket, they'll know your direction within minutes. Elena had a secondary phone, the one from the hospital locker, tucked in her coat pocket. That one Vittorio didn't know about. She reached the SUV. The rear door opened before she touched the handle. Clara was inside, along with a woman Elena hadn't met, mid-30s, quiet, with the careful eyes of someone trained to assess threats quickly. Clara introduced her only as May and left it at that. "Anyone follow you out of the building?" Clara asked. No. Dario wasn't at the desk. There was a different security guard, younger. I don't think he knows my face well enough to flag it. Camera at the elevator bank? I took the service elevator. Like you said. Clara looked at her for 1 second, then nodded and said to the driver, "Go." The SUV pulled into traffic and Elena pressed her back against the seat and felt Marco's weight against her chest, warm and solid and real, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that felt like relief before she locked it back down. She wasn't safe yet. She wasn't anywhere close to safe yet. She was in a car in Manhattan, and Vittorio Kane was somewhere in this city, and his network of eyes and ears covered a significant portion of it. And she had perhaps 3 to 4 hours before he returned to the penthouse and found her gone. 3 to 4 hours. "What's the route?" she asked. "We're not flying," Clara said. "Too many checkpoints Vittorio could potentially influence, given what Nicholas told me about his reach. We're driving to a transfer point in New Jersey. From there, you take a second vehicle to a safe house in Pennsylvania for 2 nights while we finalize the Oregon documentation. Then a third vehicle takes you the rest of the way." She paused. "It's slow. It's designed to be slow. Fast movements leave patterns. Slow ones are harder to reconstruct." Elena absorbed that. "And Marco's documentation, it's clean. Everything is in your name. You're his mother. You have his birth certificate and his hospital records. You haven't done anything illegal, Elena. You're a mother leaving with her child. That's not a crime. Vittorio will make it look like one. He'll try." Clara's voice was even. "That's why you need to be somewhere he can't reach you before he files anything. Once you're in Oregon and we have you established at the address, Nicholas begins the preemptive legal filing. You're not running from a custody order. There isn't one yet. You're relocating, and you're doing it with evidence that will make his legal strategy collapse before it gets off the ground." Elena looked out the window. Manhattan was waking up around them, delivery trucks and early joggers and the first wave of people heading for the subway. She had lived in this city for 11 years. She had walked these streets in every season, in every kind of exhaustion, had eaten bodega sandwiches at 6 a.m. after long shifts and watched the Hudson at dusk from the High Line, and known the specific way the city smelled after rain in April. She didn't know if she was ever coming back. She held that thought for exactly as long as she could stand it, and then she put it somewhere she could get to later, and she focused on Marco's breathing instead. Vittorio Kane returned to the penthouse at 5:17 a.m. Emin stood in his son's empty nursery for a long time before he moved. He read the note twice. Then he set it down on the kitchen island and stood very still, the way he stood when he was in the middle of something that required precision rather than force. His first reaction was not rage. That surprised him in the brief instant he had to observe his own reactions. His first reaction was a cold, spreading recognition, the specific feeling of realizing that something had been happening around him that he had failed to see, which was the feeling he hated more than any other. He called Dario. Dario picked up on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. "She's gone," Vittorio said. "Pull every camera from midnight to 5A. Every elevator, every lobby exit, the parking structure, the street cameras, if you can access them. I want to know exactly when she left and which direction she went." A pause. "The service elevator doesn't have pull what you have." Now he ended the call and picked up the USB drive. He took it to his office and plugged it in and sat in the same chair Elena had sat in 6 weeks earlier, and opened the files. He went through them methodically, which cost him something, because methodical required a level of detachment he was struggling to maintain. The photographs of himself and Serena. The financial records she'd found, not all of them, but enough. The emails. And then, at the bottom of the drive, the custody documents he'd thought were locked in a folder with an encrypted file name. She'd found those too. He pushed back from the desks and stood. He crossed to the window and looked at the city going gray and pink with early morning, his hands on the glass, and he stayed there for a full minute before he turned around and called his attorney. Marcus Webb answered on the fourth ring, which meant he'd been asleep. "She left," Vittorio said without preamble. "She has the custody documents. She has the financial records. She has photographs." A pause. "She had help." This wasn't improvised. Webb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the measured cadence of a man who had delivered complicated news to powerful men many times and understood that how you delivered it mattered as much as what you said. "The filing we discussed, do you want to accelerate?" "I want to file today. I want an emergency motion for Vittorio." Webb's voice was careful. "If she already has those documents and she's already gone, she's almost certainly filing first. Or her attorney is. If that evidence reaches a judge before we establish our counter-narrative, then make sure it doesn't. It's not that simple. If the financial records she has are the ones I think they are, there are exposure issues beyond the did I matter that." "Marcus." Vittorio's voice dropped the register he used when the conversation was ending. "File today, find out who her attorney is, and find her." He ended the call. He stood in his office in the silence of his empty penthouse, and he looked at the USB drive on his desk, and he thought about Elena, not the Elena of the last 6 months, not the distant, careful woman she'd become, but the Elena he had married. The one who had stood at the back of a charity gala in a dress she'd worn before, holding a sparkling water, laughing at something he'd said with an ease that hadn't been performed. He had underestimated her. The recognition of that sat in his chest with the weight of something heavy and exact. He would not make that mistake again. By 7 a.m., Dario had pieced together what the cameras showed. Elena leaving through the service elevator at 452A. Marco in the carrier, diaper bag on her shoulder, moving at a walk that had nothing hurried about it. The street cameras lost her 2 blocks east of the building, at a gap in coverage where a camera had been offline for routine maintenance for the past 3 days. Vittorio looked at the timestamp and the gap in the footage and felt a cold respect he didn't want to feel. "She knew about the maintenance window," he said. Dario hesitated. "That information went through internal communications, which means someone helped her, and whoever helped her had access to our internal schedule." Vittorio turned to look at him. Or she found it herself. He thought about the weeks before. Elena moving through the apartment the way she always moved. Making coffee, talking about Marco's sleep schedule. Asking him once, conversationally, whether the building was doing the camera upgrade they'd mentioned in the tenant letter. He had said yes. Next week, 3 of the exterior cameras on the east side were being cycled. He had told her himself. That one landed differently. He walked back to his office and closed the door and picked up a different phone, one that was not monitored by anyone, including Marcus Webb, and called a man named Garrett, who found people for a living and had never, in 12 years of working for Vittorio, failed to locate someone. "I need you to find my wife," he said when Garrett picked up. "She has my son. She left this morning, probably headed out of the city. She had helped professional relocation, I think. not friends or family. Whoever ran this for her covered their tracks, but someone paid for it. Find the money? Time yesterday. Nicholas Reeve was in his office at 7:45 when his assistant knocked and told him Marcus Webb's office had called 3 times in the past 40 minutes. He had been expecting this. He had not expected it quite this fast. He looked at the file open on his desk, Elena's file, the one he'd spent the better part of 2 weeks building, with the kind of careful, layered documentation that wasn't designed to win an argument, but to prevent one. He picked up his phone and called Webb's direct line. Webb answered immediately. Marcus. Nicholas. Webb's voice was smooth, which was the voice Webb used when he was working. I assume you know why I'm calling, I can guess. My client wants to discuss a resolution, something that avoids the public exposure that would come from contested proceedings. Nicholas leaned back in his chair. What kind of resolution? Generous financial settlement. Joint custody structure with primary physical to my client during school year. Elena retains full decision-making rights on medical and educational matters. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. Marcus, we both know what's in those documents Elena found. We both know what that custody strategy your client prepared looks like to a judge. And we both know that the financial records she has are going to create a significant problem for Vittorio in several arenas that have nothing to do with family court. A pause. That's a very aggressive opening position for someone whose client is currently in an unknown location with a child. Elena is a mother who left her home with her infant son. She hasn't violated any custody order, there isn't one. She relocated, which is her legal right. Everything she did was within the bounds of the law. Nicholas let that sit. Can your client say the same about his conduct over the past 14 months? The silence on Webb's end lasted several seconds longer than a comfortable one. I'll relay your position, Webb said finally. You do that. Nicholas set his phone down and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He had 48 hours, he estimated, before Vittorio's people found a thread to pull. Maybe less. He picked up his phone again and sent a single text to the secure number Clara had given him. Clock is moving faster than expected. How far? The response came back in 4 minutes. Pennsylvania. On schedule, he exhaled. The safe house in Pennsylvania was a 3-bedroom ranch outside a small town with more farms than streetlights. May had driven them there after the New Jersey transfer, a quiet 4-hour drive during which Marco had slept for 2 hours, cried for 40 minutes, fed twice, and finally settled into the kind of exhausted unconsciousness that only infants achieve. Elena not slept at all. She sat at the kitchen table of the ranch house while May made coffee and Marco lay on a blanket on the floor, examining his own hands with the focused concentration he brought to everything. Clara had stayed behind in New York. May was efficient and spare with words, which Elena respected. She answered questions directly and didn't ask any she didn't need to. She brought food. She showed Elena the emergency protocols where the secondary vehicle was, what to do if the location was compromised, who to call in what order. Elena asked her, on the first evening while they sat on opposite ends of the small couch, with mugs of tea and neither of them was really drinking, how many times have you done this? May considered the question. 14 times in 5 years. And everyone I've moved is still alive and in a place they chose to be. She looked at her mug. That's the metric I care about. Elena nodded. She called Nicholas on the secure phone at 9 p.m. He told her about Webb's call and the proposed resolution. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, no. I expected that. He prepared documents to take my son from me. He built a file designed to make me look like I was mentally unfit to parent. He had someone follow me. Her voice was level, but underneath it was something that had weight. He doesn't get to offer me a deal that gives him joint custody and call it generous. Elena, I'm not negotiating out of fear, Nicholas. I'm not doing this because I'm desperate. I'm doing this because he was wrong. And I want a judge to say so. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. Okay. Then we build the case and we take it to court. But you need to understand this will not be clean. Vittorio has resources, he has attorneys, and he will fight this in every forum available to him. It will be long and it will be ugly. I know, and you're prepared for that. I've been prepared for something hard for the last 8 months, she said. I just didn't know yet what form it was going to take. After she ended the call, she sat with Marco in the quiet of the ranch house, reading him the back of a granola bar box because it was the only thing printed in the room, and he seemed to find the sound of her voice interesting regardless of content. And she thought about Vittorio, standing in their penthouse. Right now, his penthouse, and the look on his face when he opened the USB drive and understood the shape of what she'd done. She wasn't glad about it. That surprised her a little. She wasn't glad. She was resolved, which was different and harder and less satisfying. Back in Manhattan, Vittorio's day had the quality of controlled deterioration. By noon, Garrett had traced a financial thread to a small bank in Midtown, an account opened recently in Elena's name with a cash initial deposit. The account had a single outgoing wire transaction to a corporation registered in Delaware with a name that meant nothing until Garrett ran the registered agent, at which point it connected, through 2 layers, to a woman named Clara Rourke. Vittorio knew the name, not personally, but he knew the type of operation she ran. His own network occasionally crossed paths with the kind of infrastructure that moved people quietly. It occupied a particular corner of the city's shadow economy, and a man in his position was aware of it without ever needing to use it. He had not expected Elena to find her way to it. He called Garrett back. Clara Rourke, what can you tell me? Caref experienced. She doesn't make obvious mistakes. A pause. She's also legally clean, nothing you can take to law enforcement. I'm not planning to involve law enforcement. Another pause. Her network has a reach safe houses in several states, a transport infrastructure that uses multiple vehicle changes to break tracking. If she moved Elena, she's not going to be findable through the transaction trail alone. Garrett's voice was measured. I'll keep pulling. But you should know this woman is good at what she does. Vittorio set his phone down. He thought about the night he'd stood at the back of a charity gala and found Elena Moretti standing near the bar in a dress she'd worn before, holding a sparkling water, exhausted from a double shift and not pretending otherwise. He had been drawn to that, the realness of her, the fact that she wasn't performing anything. He had spent the better part of 2 years slowly, methodically replacing that realness with fear and exhaustion and isolation, and he had done it without ever quite registering that that was what he was doing. That was the thing about control, it never felt like cruelty from the inside. From the inside, it felt like protection. Like efficiency. Like knowing better than the person you were controlling what they actually needed. He was not a man given to self-examination. But sitting in his office in the afternoon quiet of his empty penthouse, he had a brief, sharp moment of seeing himself from outside, and the view was not good. He closed that window. He was not going to sit in his office and mourn his own behavior while his son was in an unknown location. He could examine his failures at a later date. Right now, he needed to think. Nicholas Reeve. That was the thread. Elena hadn't found Clara Rourke on her own. Someone with legal knowledge and appropriate connections had made that introduction. And the only person Elena had been in contact with outside his monitored channels who fit that description was Nicholas Reeve. He knew about Nicholas, had known since Elena had mentioned him once, 18 months ago, as the attorney whose life she'd helped save. Vittorio had flagged it then as low relevance and moved on. He had misjudged the relevance. He picked up his phone. I want everything you can find on Nicholas Reeve, he told Garrett. His clients, his financial exposure, his pressure points. That's a different kind of work than finding people. I know. Can you do it? A beat. Give me 24 hours. The pressure arrived at Nicholas's office the next morning, in a form he had not fully anticipated, which meant he had anticipated the wrong vector. He had expected Vittorio to push through legal channels web filing emergency motions, procedural moves designed to force Elena's location into the record. That was the move he'd prepared for. What he hadn't prepared for was Vittorio's reach into the Bar Association grievance process, which was a longer, slower, more insidious form of pressure. At 9 a.m., Nicolette received a formal notification that an anonymous grievance had been filed against him, alleging that he had assisted a client in removing a child from a shared family residence without disclosure to the co-parent. The grievance was meritless. Elena hadn't violated any order. There was no custody arrangement to... But meritless grievances still required responses. They still consumed time and created institutional headaches, and, in the hands of a skilled operator, could be leveraged into a narrative about an attorney with compromised judgment. Nicholas read the notification twice, then set it down. He knew what this was. It wasn't a legal strategy. It was a message. I know you're the one who helped her, and I have the resources to make your professional life difficult for as long as I choose. He thought about calling Webb and telling him exactly what he thought of that message. Instead, he called the one person whose judgment in situations of applied pressure he trusted completely. "He's coming at me through the bar," he told her, when Vivian Hart picked up. A pause. "What kind?" "Grievance filing. Anonymous." Completely fabricated, but that's not the point. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to destabilize you. If you're managing a bar complaint, you have less bandwidth for Elena's case. And if he can create a perception that her attorney has ethical questions attached to his name, it poisons the well before we get to the courtroom." "Yes." Another pause. "Nicholas, how solid is your file?" "Airtight. Everything Elena did was legal. Everything I've done is within professional standards." "Then respond to the grievance. Document your response, and don't let it consume more than it deserves." Vivian's voice had the specific firmness someone who had spent 4 decades in institutions that required you to hold your ground while powerful people tried to move you. "And call me as a witness, if it comes to that. I've known Elena for 8 years. I can speak to her character with specificity that no attorney Vittorio hires is going to be able to counter." "He might come at you too." "Let him try," Vivian said, with a flatness that wasn't bravado but something older and more settled. "I've dealt with men like Vittorio Kane my entire professional life. The difference between them and a difficult patient is that the patient eventually accepts they need help. Men like Vittorio never do." Nicholas sat with that for a moment. "Then thank you, Vivian." "Don't thank me." "When?" On the second day in the Pennsylvania safe house, Elena had the first real conversation with May that wasn't logistical. It started because Marco was having a difficult afternoon, overtired, unsettled from the disruption to his routine, crying in the particular sustained and exhausted way that sits just below inconsolable. Elena had been holding him for 90 minutes, walking the small hallway of the ranch house, and May had finally appeared in the doorway and said, without asking, "Let me take him for a while." Elena had handed him over. She had gone to the kitchen and sat at the table and put her head in her hands and let herself but tired in a way she hadn't permitted herself since before she left. After a few minutes, she heard Marco's crying diminish and then stop. She looked up. May had him against her shoulder, moving in a slow side-to-side rhythm, and was looking out the window at the gray Pennsylvania afternoon. "Do you have kids?" Elena asked. May didn't look away from the window. "I had a daughter. She was 4 when I left my husband. She's 17 now." "Left how?" "The same way you left." A pause. "He found us after 8 months. Not through Clara, she hadn't made a mistake. Through my sister, who didn't understand what was at stake and mentioned our general location in a phone call she didn't know he was monitoring." Elena felt something cold move through her. "What happened?" "He tried to take her. She was in school. He walked into the school." May's voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had never entirely quieted. "He didn't succeed. Clara's network has protocols for that. But it was close enough that I understood what close felt like." She finally looked at Elena. "I'm telling you this not to frighten you, but so you understand why I don't take anything for granted. Not the safe house location. Not the communication protocols. Not who knows what," she held Elena's gaze. "Not anything." Elena nodded. "He got supervised visitation," May continued, looking back out the window. "Twice a month in a monitored environment. My daughter refuses to go. She's 17. The court can't make her." Something that might have been satisfaction moved across her face. "She's remarkable. She got through all of it, and she's remarkable." Marco made a small sound, not distress, more the half-awake murmur of a baby drifting back toward sleep. Elena watched May with her son and felt something that wasn't quite hope but was adjacent to it. The knowledge that other women had been exactly here in exactly this kind of exhausted, provisional safety and had made it through to the other side. Not cleanly, not without damage, but through. She was going to make it through. On the 3rd day, Garrett found something. He called Vittorio at 6 in the morning, which meant it was significant. "Clara Rourke's network has a property in Pennsylvania. I can't confirm it's where they are, but the timing matches and the routing makes sense. New Jersey transfer point, then a secondary vehicle heading southwest." A pause. "I have a rough county, not an address." Vittorio was already standing, already moving. "Send me what you have." Vittorio. Garrett's voice had a careful quality that Vittorio recognized the voice of a man delivering information he wasn't sure how it would be used. "If you're thinking about going there yourself." "I'm not," Vittorio said, which was not entirely true in that moment, but he understood, in the part of himself that was still thinking clearly, that driving to rural Pennsylvania to confront his wife at a safe house would be the single most effective way to destroy any remaining legal credibility he had. I'm not. I just need to know where she is. He looked at the information Garrett sent. A county in central Pennsylvania. Farm country. Could be 200 properties. He called Webb. File the emergency motion today. I want a location disclosure requirement. She has to provide an address for the child. That's a legitimate legal demand. He paused. And find out if any of Clara Rourke's documented properties are in. He looked at the county name Center County, Pennsylvania. Webb was quiet for a moment. Vittorio, filing the emergency motion is going to accelerate the timeline on the counterfiling. If her attorney responds with the evidence she has, let them respond. I'd rather fight in the open than have my son in an unknown location. His voice had the quality of a decision already made. File it, Marcus. He ended the call and stood at the window of his penthouse, looking at a city that had always bent toward him, and felt for the first time in his adult life the specific shape of something that was not going to bend. Nicolette received the emergency motion notification at 2 in the afternoon, which was faster than he'd expected. He read through it standing at his desk. The motion requested immediate location disclosure for Marco, citing the child's right to access to both parents and the absence of any documented safety concern. He sat down, he thought carefully. Then he called Elena. He filed, he said when she answered. A pause. He could hear Marco in the background, a small persistent sound. What does that mean? It means we're in it now. He's asking the court to compel you to disclose where you are. He let that land before continuing. I'm going to file our response today, with the evidence. All of it. The custody strategy, the financial records, the documented affair, the surveillance of your movements. I'm going to ask the court to issue a protective order that maintains your current location confidentiality on the grounds of documented coercive behavior. Will they grant it? I don't know yet. The judge matters. The evidence matters. But Elena, once I file that response, it becomes a public record. Everything in those documents, Vittorio's financial information, the affair, the custody plan, it goes into the court file. Silence on her end. That's going to expose him, she said.
Yes.
In ways that go beyond the custody case.
Yes.
She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of something that had been decided already, the decision just catching up to the words. File it, Nicholas. He had expected that answer. He had prepared for it. He hung up and turned to his computer and opened the document he'd been building for 2 weeks, every piece of evidence Elena had given him, organized, corroborated, cross-referenced with financial records and sworn statements, and the specific kind of careful, thorough documentation that was designed to be undeniable. His hands were steady on the keyboard. He began to file. And somewhere in a ranch house in central Pennsylvania, Elena Moretti set down her phone and picked up her sons and stood at the window, looking at the gray fields of a state she'd never lived in. Understanding that the thing she had set in motion when she walked out of that penthouse 3 days ago had just passed the point where it could be walked back. There was no more quiet preparation, no more moving pieces in the dark. The documents were going into the court file. Vittorio was going to read them. And whatever came next was going to be fought in the open, in front of a judge, with the lights on. She pressed her face against the top of Marco's head and felt him grip her shirt with one small certain fist, and she thought, whatever comes next, I'm ready for it. She almost believed it. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. The court filing went through at 4:47 p. On a Thursday, Nicholas hit send, leaned back in his chair, and sat very still for about 30 seconds, the particular stillness of a man who has just released something into the world that cannot be recalled. Then he forwarded the confirmation to Elena's secure phone, closed his laptop, and went to make himself a cup of coffee he didn't end up drinking. By 6 p.m., Marcus Webb had been served with the response. By 7 p.m., Vittorio Kane had read every page. Nicholas knew this because Garrett, who was, as it turned out, a man whose loyalties were tied entirely to whoever was paying him, and not to any particular outcome, called him at 7:23 p.m. from a number Nicholas didn't recognize. Nicholas almost didn't answer. He answered. "This is Garrett," the voice said. "I work for Vittorio Kane." I'm calling because I think you should know that he read your filing an hour ago, and I've never seen him react to anything the way he reacted to that. Nicholas set his coffee cup down very carefully. Why are you calling me? Because I've done a lot of things for Vittorio Kane over 12 years, and most of them I can live with. But he just gave me an instruction I'm not going to carry out, and I think you need to know what it was. The pause that followed was brief. He told me to find the Pennsylvania property and make sure Elena couldn't use those documents again. He didn't specify how. He didn't need to. Another pause. I'm not doing that. Nicholas felt something cold move through the center of his chest. Are you telling me he's planning to go after her directly? I'm telling you he's not thinking clearly right now, and he said something he might not have said if he was. But I don't know how long that window is. A pause. I'm also telling you that the county I gave him earlier, he has people who can narrow that down faster than you'd think. The line went dead. Nicholas stood at his kitchen counter for 4 seconds. Then he called May's number. May picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. He may have a location, Nicholas said. Not the address, but the county. And he's not in a rational place right now. You need to move Elena tonight. A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. How much time? I don't know. Hours maybe. Maybe less. Understood. May's voice had dropped to the flat operational tone that meant she had already switched modes. Tell Clara. The line went silent. Leista was feeding Marco when May appeared in the doorway of the small bedroom with her coat already on and her keys in her hand, and Elena looked at her face and understood before a word was spoken. We're leaving, May said. Elena didn't ask why. She had promised herself, back in Clara's first meeting, that she would not ask unnecessary questions in moments that required movement. She set Marco against her shoulder, reached for the blanket with her free hand, and said, "Give me 90 seconds." She had lived out of the diaper bag for 3 days. There was nothing to pack. She was already packed. That was the point of the way she'd done it. Everything that mattered fit in one bag, because you could only run with what you could carry. She was at the back door in 80 seconds. May had a vehicle she hadn't used before, a gray pickup truck, older, nothing that would read as notable on a rural road at night. She had Elena and Marco in the back seat with a blanket over the car seat in a way that reduced the visible silhouette from outside the windows. She drove without lights for the first quarter mile, which was the kind of detail that made Elena realize May had done this in exactly this kind of urgency before. They drove for 20 minutes in silence. Then May's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Said nothing, drove. Elena asked, "What was that?" Clara May said, "The motion got picked up by a court reporter. It's going to be in the legal news feeds by morning." A pause. "The financial records you gave Nicholas, the ones from Vittorio's secondary accounts, there's a federal thread in there." Nicholas flagged it. The U.S. Attorney's Office has apparently been watching Vittorio Kane for a while. Seeing those records in a public court filing is going to accelerate something that was already in motion. Elena absorbed that. How does that affect us? It complicates Vittorio's position significantly. A man under federal scrutiny who is simultaneously engaged in a contested custody fight with documented evidence of attempted coercion against his wife. May glanced in the rearview mirror. It doesn't help him. Does it help me? A beat. It keeps him occupied with something other than finding you. For a while, May's eyes went back to the road. But Elena, a man who feels cornered from multiple directions at once, is more dangerous, not less. Not less. You understand that. Elena looked at Marco, asleep in the car seat, face slack and utterly unguarded the way only sleeping babies' faces are. I understand, she said. They reached the second safe house at 1A. A different county, a property Clara's network maintained through a shell arrangement, a converted farmhouse that smelled like cedar and old radiators, and was warm in the way of houses that have been keeping people warm for a long time. There was a woman there already older, maybe 65, who introduced herself as Ruth and handed Elena a bowl of soup without asking whether she wanted it. Asina sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup and watched May walk the perimeter of the property with a flashlight in a systematic pattern, checking something Asina didn't need to understand to appreciate. She put Marco in the portable crib Clara's network kept at each location. He resettled without waking, which was the small mercy of that night. She sat back down at the kitchen table and thought. The thing she'd been not quite letting herself think about had arrived finally, and it sat across from her in the quiet kitchen of that farmhouse and waited. She had known in the abstract that filing those documents would trigger consequences beyond the custody case. Nicholas had told her. She had said file it because she believed it was right, because Vittorio deserved to have his actions documented and witnessed by someone with authority. She still believed that, but she had not let herself feel, until right now, what it meant that she had potentially handed a federal investigation the document it needed to act. That Vittorio Kane, whatever he was, whatever he had done to her, was Marco's father. And that whatever happened to Vittorio would become, in some form, part of Marco's history. She hadn't thought far enough into that. She pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed. There was no version of this where she took it back. She knew that, but she sat in the kitchen of Marv House and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done for the first time, without managing it, without redirecting it toward the practical next step. She felt it for about 10 minutes. Then Ruth refilled her coffee without being asked, and Elena straightened in her chair, and she went back to thinking about what came next. In Manhattan, the night had a different texture. Vittorio had sent 2 of his men to Center County, Pennsylvania, by 9 p.m. Not to do anything, he had told himself, just to narrow the location. To know where she was. The need to know had become almost physical, the way certain forms of loss become physical, a pressure in the chest, a specific agitation in the hands. By midnight, his men had identified 3 properties in the county with connections to corporate structures that matched the pattern Garrett had initially found. They were working through them one at a time. Webb called him at 12:30 a.m. "I need you to listen to me," Webb said without preamble, which was unusual enough that Vittorio actually listened. "The filing Nicholas Reeves submitted this afternoon has been flagged. Not by me, by someone in the federal system." A pause that had weight in it. "Vittorio, the financial records in that filing the secondary accounts Elena found on your laptop, those are accounts that the Southern District has had a warrant interest in for approximately 8 months. I was not aware of the scope of that investigation until tonight, when I made some calls." Vittorio sat down. "Define scope," he said. "Wire fraud, organized conspiracy, RICO-adjacent structuring violations." Webb's voice had taken on the careful flatness of a man reading from a document he wishes he didn't have to read. "The records Elena found and gave to Nicholas aren't just evidence in a custody dispute, Vittorio. They are potentially the documentary link the federal investigation has been missing. If the U.S. Attorney's Office, how long have you known about the federal investigation?" A pause. "I learned the full scope tonight, Marcus." His voice was very quiet. "How long?" Another pause. "Longer. I became aware of a preliminary inquiry approximately 4 months ago. I advised certain restructuring steps to address potential exposure. I did not advise you directly because I assessed the risk level. You knew there was a federal inquiry into my finances for 4 months, and you didn't tell me." The silence on Webb's end had the quality of a man who has run out of good options and is deciding which bad one to use. "I was managing the exposure," Webb said finally. "I believed I had it contained." Vittorio set his phone down without ending the call. He sat there and looked at the wall of his office, the same wall he had looked at 100 times, while making the decisions that had built his empire and, it now appeared, constructed the architecture of his own undoing. His attorney had known about a federal investigation into his finances for 4 months. His wife had found the financial records that connected that investigation to a documented paper trail. His wife's attorney had filed those records in a public court document. And now the question was not whether the U.S. Attorney's Office would act. The question was how quickly. He picked the phone back up. "Get here," he said to Webb. "Tonight." Webb arrived at the penthouse at 1:15 a.m. He was a trim, silver-haired man of 60 who projected an air of permanent competence, and he walked into Vittorio's office looking, for the first time in 12 years of professional relationship, like a man who was not entirely certain of his footing. Vittorio didn't offer him a seat. "Tell me the actual exposure," Vittorio said. "Not the managed version, the actual one." Webb set his briefcase on the desk and opened it, and removed a legal pad covered in his handwriting. He had been up since 6 a.m., and it showed around his eyes, which were red at the edges and careful in the way of eyes that had been doing hard calculations for many hours. The secondary accounts Elena found they document 11 transactions between March of last year and February of this year. The source funds passed through 3 shell entities before reaching those accounts, and the originating source is a set of contracts with two companies that the Southern District believes are fronts for laundering proceeds from Webb stopped. From the Palermo arrangement, Vittorio looked at him. The Palermo arrangement, he repeated. Yes, Marcus. The Palermo arrangement doesn't exist on paper anywhere. We spent 8 months making sure of that. It didn't exist on paper, Webb said. But the money it generated had to go somewhere, and some of it went through accounts that are now in a federal court filing. He met Vittorio's gaze and held it, which took visible effort. Elena found the endpoint. The federal investigation had the origin. With the filing, they now have a bridge between the two. The silence in the room lasted a long time. What are we looking at? Vittorio said finally. If they move on this, and they will move, it's a question of timing RICO exposure, potentially. Why are it certain? The structuring violations alone are 5 to 7 years. Webb paused. With cooperation, it's significantly reduced. Without, he stopped. I'm not cooperating. Vittorio, I said no. He turned and walked to the window. Find a way to challenge the admissibility of those records. They were obtained without my knowledge from a private device. She's your wife. The device was in a shared residence. The admissibility argument is find a way. Webb was quiet for a moment. I'll try. But I want you to understand the filing is public. Even if we challenge the records in the custody proceeding, the federal investigation doesn't need the court filing to proceed. They have their own parallel sources. The filing, just he chose the word, carefully confirmed a connection they'd been attempting to establish. Vittorio stood at the window with his back to Webb and looked at the city and understood that the thing he had always believed, that his money and his power and his network would always be sufficient to maintain his position, had just been tested. By a 31-year-old nurse with a diaper bag and a drive he'd left unlocked and had been found insufficient. Get out, he said, without turning around. Webb left. Vittorio stood at the window for a long time. The call that arrived at 6 a.m. was not one he expected. Serena, he almost didn't answer. Then he did. I saw the court filing, she said. Her voice was different from how it usually sounded, quieter, stripped of the composed quality she normally carried, said. Vittorio, the photographs, the emails, they're in the public record. I know, my name is in them. I know that too. A pause. I have a meeting with the board of the Whitmore Foundation at 9 a.m. I've been on that board for 6 years. Those photographs, she stopped. Vittorio, you told me this was under control. Things changed. Things changed. She repeated it back to him with a precision that was almost surgical. You told me 4 months ago that Elena would accept a settlement and that this would be handled quietly. You told me that the custody arrangement was a precaution and that the documents you had prepared would never need to be used. You told me, her voice broke slightly and then reassembled itself. You told me a great many things that were not true. He said nothing. I want you to understand something clearly, Serena said. I am not going to be the woman in those photographs who helps you fight this. I am not going to be the person who provides you with any kind of public support while there is a federal. She stopped herself. I heard about the federal piece. One of my attorneys called me at midnight. Serena? No, her voice was flat. Whatever I am to you, I am not going down with this. I'm not doing it. A pause. I'm sorry for what happened to Elena. I should have said that to her face when I had the chance. I didn't. That's something I'm going to have to manage on my own. A longer pause. Don't call me again. The line went dead. Vittorio set his phone on the window ledge and stood there with the early morning city below him, and the loss of Serena barely registered, which told him something about the state he was in, because a month ago it would have registered. What registered was the clear, cold understanding that he was now without his attorney's effective help, without Serena's social help, without Serena's social cover, without the financial structures that had supported his operation, and without his son. He had one viable move. He had to find Elena before the federal investigation moved. Not to harm her. He had clarity on that. At least harming her would accelerate every timeline against him and remove the last remaining argument that he was a man whose interests were compatible with his son's well-being. But he needed to find her. He needed to sit across from her in a room and have the kind of conversation that couldn't happen through lawyers, the kind that didn't generate a court record. He needed her to hear him. Whether she would was a different question. He picked up his phone and called the men in Pennsylvania. Where are you? Second property was empty. Moving to the third. It's about 40 minutes out. Call me when you're there. He ended the call and walked to the kitchen and made himself coffee. For the first time in years, his housekeeper usually did it, but he'd sent the household staff home 2 days ago because he needed the apartment empty, and he couldn't manage other people's presence right now. He stood over the machine and watched it drip and thought about Elena in that NICU, sitting next to Marco's isolette for 8 to 12 hours a day, talking to him in a low voice about things she planned to show him someday. He had not been there. He had been choosing not to be there, though he hadn't put it that way to himself at the time. The coffee finished. He poured it. He didn't drink it. His phone rang. Pennsylvania. Third property, the man said. It's empty. Recently vacated maybe 2-3 hours ago. Food still in the refrigerator. Fire in the stove still warm. Vittorio put his hand flat on the kitchen counter. She had moved again. She had moved in the night, which meant someone had warned her, which meant there was a leak in his operation he had not yet identified. He ran the list of people who had known about the Pennsylvania location in the last 12 hours. Garrett. His 2 men. Webb. Garrett. He thought about the call from Garrett that he hadn't received last night. He had called twice, no answer, which at the time he'd attributed to Garrett being on the ground. He thought about the way Garrett had sounded on the phone 2 days ago, when he'd given him the instruction about the documents. I'm not doing that. Garrett had called someone else. He exhaled through his nose. Come back, he told his men. He set the phone down on the counter next to the untouched coffee and stood in his kitchen in the early morning quiet of a penthouse that had never felt as empty as it felt right now. And he acknowledged to himself in the blunt, private way that men who deal in reality acknowledge things they'd prefer not to, that Elena was better at this than he had expected. That the woman he had spent 8 months slowly dismantling had apparently been paying close attention to how dismantling worked and had applied that knowledge in reverse, taking apart his certainties one by one with a patience and precision that should not have surprised him as much as it did. And now she was somewhere he couldn't find her. His financial infrastructure was in federal crosshairs. His attorney had been managing him rather than representing him. And the only person who had information about Elena's current location was a man named Garrett, who had apparently decided to stop working for him. The federal piece was the wall he couldn't see around. RICO exposure without cooperation meant a decade or more. With cooperation, with the right cooperation, it meant something survivable. But cooperation meant giving government something. And the only something he had that was currently worth enough to matter was information about the Palermo arrangement, which meant giving up men who would view being given up as an act of war. He couldn't cooperate, not without consequences that made federal prosecution look manageable. He couldn't fight the federal case effectively with the financial records already in the public court filing. He couldn't find Elena through conventional surveillance because she was inside a protection network designed specifically to be invisible to people like him. He had no viable move. That was the first time in his adult life he had genuinely arrived at that assessment. He stood in his kitchen and felt at the absence of a move, the specific texture of a situation that had no exit through force or money or information. His entire adult life had been built on the belief that every situation had a pressure point, and that a man who was willing to apply enough pressure to the right place would always find a way through. He was finding the limit of that belief. He picked up the coffee, finally, and drank it, and it was cold. Elena didn't know any of this yet. She was asleep in the farmhouse bedroom, Marco warm beside her in the portable crib, when her secure phone buzzed with a message from Nicholas at 7 a.m. She read it with her eyes still adjusting to the light. Federal development. Call me when you're up. Important but not emergency. She sat up. She looked at Marco, still sleeping. She pulled the blanket her grandmother had made up over her shoulders and held the phone and thought about what federal development meant in the context of what she'd filed, and what it meant for the man who was her son's father, and what it was going to mean for Marco 15 years from now, when he was old enough to want to understand the full shape of his own history. She had made the right call. She still believed that. But right didn't always mean clean. She had known that going in the abstract. She was knowing it now in the specifics, in the particular weight of a 7:30 morning in an unfamiliar farmhouse. And the difference between abstract knowledge and specific knowledge was about 30 pounds and had dark eyes and was breathing steadily 3 feet away from her. She called Nicholas. He answered on the first ring. Talk to me, she said. The financial records you gave me, S. Attorney's Office has had a parallel investigation into Vittorio's financial structure for 8 months. Your documents provided a connection they'd been unable to establish through their own sources. A pause. They reached out to me last night. Not formally, informally, through a channel. They want to talk to you. Elena felt the room shift slightly. About what you saw on that laptop. About the full scope of what was in those accounts. They have the documents, but documents need context, and you were in that household. You understood what you were looking at. He paused. Elena, I want to be clear you have no legal obligation to cooperate with a federal investigation. You are not a target. You have not done anything wrong. This is entirely your choice. She looked at the wall across from the bed, where someone had hung a small watercolor of a field that might have been painted by a child or a very unsentimental adult. What does cooperating mean? It means talking to them. Telling them what you observed in that household. What the accounts were connected to in your understanding. What conversations you overheard. The context you can provide that makes those financial records legible. Another pause. If you cooperate and your testimony contributes materially to a successful prosecution, it would effectively end Vittorio's ability to use his criminal infrastructure in the custody fight. He'd be occupied for a very long time. And if I don't cooperate, the federal investigation proceeds with or without you. It just takes longer and there's no guarantee of the outcome. He let a silence sit. I'm not pushing you either way. I'm telling you the landscape. She sat there with the phone against her ear and thought about all of it, every piece of it, in every direction for about a minute. Then she said, set up the meeting. A pause. Elena. Set it up, Nicholas. I'll talk to them. She ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not from despair, but from the weight of the decision, the acknowledgement that she had just agreed to do something that would change the remaining shape of this story in ways she couldn't fully predict. Marco woke up at that moment, which babies do with an absolute disregard for the emotional timing of everyone around them. He woke up making the small indignant sounds of someone who has just discovered, once again, that being awake is an inconvenience worth announcing. Elena lifted him out of the crib and held him against her, and he grabbed a fistful of her hair, and she winced, and he seemed satisfied by this result. Okay, she said to him quietly, in the cold morning of the Pennsylvania farmhouse. Okay? She was not talking about the hair. She was talking about all of it, the federal meeting, the long road she had just committed to, the fact that the man who was this baby's father was somewhere in Manhattan this morning, understanding that his world was coming apart in multiple directions at once, and that she had been the one who had set most of those directions in motion. She was talking about the fact that she had done all of this to protect her son, and that protecting her son was going to require her to keep making decisions like this one, decisions that were right and hard and not clean, and hers. She held Marco a little tighter. He made a sound that was not quite a word but had the conviction of one. And somewhere in Manhattan, at that exact moment, Vittorio Kane set down a cold cup of coffee and finally allowed himself to understand that he had already lost. He just hadn't yet decided what to do about it. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. The federal meeting happened 9 days later in a conference room in Philadelphia that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and recycled air. Elena sat on one side of the table. Across from her were 2 attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a woman named Diaz, late 30s, precise in the way of someone who had learned that precision was the only thing that held in rooms like this one, and a man named Carver who said almost nothing and wrote almost everything. Nicholas sat beside Elena. He had driven from New York that morning and had been quiet most of the ride, which she appreciated. Diaz opened a folder and set it on the table between them. We're going to go through the accounts you documented, she said. I want you to tell me in your own words everything you remember about the context around each transaction. Not what the numbers say, the numbers we have. I want the conversations you overheard, the names you heard mentioned, anything that gives us the human layer underneath the financial record. Elena looked at the folder. She had looked at those documents so many times in the previous weeks that she could reconstruct most of them from memory. All right, she said. They went for 4 hours. Elena talked and Carver wrote, and Diaz occasionally asked a question that was so precisely targeted it felt like a scalpel rather than a question. Elena answered everything she could answer, and said I don't know to the things she didn't know without trying to fill the gaps with inference, because she had learned in 12 years of nursing that the most dangerous thing you could do in a high-stakes situation was mistake what you suspected for what you knew. At the end of 4 hours, Diaz closed her folder and looked at Elena with an expression that was not warm, but was something a specific form of acknowledgement. "You're a careful witness," she said. "I've seen what happens when people aren't," Elena said. Diaz almost smiled. Almost. In the car on the way back, Nicholas drove, and Elena sat in the passenger seat and watched the Pennsylvania farmland turn to suburb, turn to highway, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Nicholas said, "You did well in there. I told the truth." "That's not the same as doing well. Sometimes it is." He kept his eyes on the road. "They're moving faster than I expected." Diaz told me before we left off record that the timeline on the federal case has compressed significantly since the filing. They have enough. They've had enough for a while, but the records you found closed a gap that was holding them back. A pause. "They're going to move on Vittorio within 30 days. Maybe sooner." Elena was quiet. "That affects the custody proceeding," Nicola continued. "If he's indicted, his attorneys are going to be consumed by the criminal defense. His resources are going to be constrained. His ability to pursue an aggressive custody fight becomes significantly limited." "I know, that's not why you cooperated." "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at the road ahead. "I cooperated because what he did was real, and it should be on record somewhere that it was real. Not just in family court. Somewhere with more weight than that." Nicholas nodded once and didn't say anything else. They drove. Vittorio received his first formal notice from the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Tuesday morning, a target letter, which in the specific grammar of federal procedure meant that the investigation had progressed to the point where his status had shifted from potential subject to likely defendant. Webb delivered it in person, which was the kind of thing attorneys did when they were managing a client's reactions as much as delivering information. Vittorio read it at his desk, then he set it down. Then he picked it up and read it again, more slowly. "A target letter doesn't mean indictment," Webb said. He was sitting across the desk in the chair he always used, but he was sitting in it differently than he used to, more carefully, with the body language of a man who was no longer entirely certain of his reception. "It means they've decided," Vittorio said. "It means they've built a sufficient case to consider." "Marcus," he looked up from the letter, "don't manage my language right now. It means they've decided. The question is timeline." Webb was quiet for a moment. 30 to 60 days, in my estimation. Possibly faster. He shifted in the chair. "Vittorio, I want to revisit the cooperation conversation. I know you shut it down 3 weeks ago." Give him the target letter. "No, the exposure without cooperation," I said no. He set the letter on the desk face down. "The Palermo people aren't people you give up and then continue to exist. You know that. Then we need to begin structuring a criminal defense that." "I know what we need to do." He stood. He walked to the window, which had become in recent weeks the place he stood when he needed to think without Webb watching his face. "What's the status of the custody proceeding?" Webb hesitated. "The judge has set a hearing date. 6 weeks out." Nicholas Reeve filed a motion last week requesting that Elena's current address remain sealed from the court record, citing documented safety concerns. Given the financial records and the custody strategy documents that are already in evidence, he stopped. The judge granted it. Vittorio turned around. "The judge granted a sealed address." "Yes, which means we cannot compel location disclosure through the custody proceeding. Elena can remain where she is without being required to provide an address to the court." Webb met his gaze. "It was the right ruling given the evidence, Vittorio. I want to be honest with you about that. The silence in the room was the kind that comes when a man is processing information that rearranges a significant portion of his operating assumptions. So she's protected by the court," Vittorio said. "For now. Until the hearing. And at the hearing. At the hearing, both sides present. The evidence is substantial on her side. The financial records, the affair, the surveillance documentation, the prepared custody strategy." Webb paused. "And now the federal target letter, which will almost certainly introduce as relevant to the question of whether Marco's primary residence should be with a man who is facing federal criminal prosecution." Vittorio absorbed that. "What can we offer at the hearing?" he said. "Supervised visitation. Demonstrated willingness to engage in co-parenting counseling. Financial support documentation. Webb looked at his hands for a moment. Vittorio, what we cannot offer is a counter-narrative that holds up against what she has. The best outcome we can realistically pursue in that courtroom is supervised contact and a future modification petition once the federal matter is resolved. The best outcome: supervised contact with his own son. He had built an empire on the principle that acceptable outcomes were ones he decided were acceptable. The idea that someone else, a judge, an attorney, a federal prosecutor, was going to define the terms of his relationship with Marco sat in his chest like something lodged. Set up the hearing prep, he said finally, and get me a criminal defense team. Not you, a dedicated team. He looked at Webb steadily. And Marcus, the next time you become aware of a federal inquiry into my operations, you tell me immediately. That conversation we're going to have after this is resolved. Webbs stood, gathered his papers, and left without responding to that last part, which told Vittorio everything about how Webb assessed his own future with this client. He sat back down at his desk. He opened his phone. He had one move left that wasn't legal and wasn't through an intermediary and wasn't managed by anyone's professional judgment. He was going to go see Elena himself. Not at the farmhouse in Pennsylvania, he still didn't have that address. But in 6 weeks, she had to appear at a custody hearing in New York family court. She would be in the city. She would at some point be in a room that he was also in. He was going to talk to her. The specifics of what he was going to say, he hadn't fully worked out yet. But he was going to look at her directly, without attorneys between them, and he was going to say the things that he had not said, had not been capable of saying, when they were living in the same apartment, and he had been choosing not to see what he was doing to her. Whether she would hear it was not something he could control. He was starting to understand that controlling outcomes was not always possible, and that attempt to control everything was what had put him in this room with a target letter on his desk and his son in an unknown location. He understood that. He was not sure what to do with the understanding yet, but he had it. The 6 weeks between the federal target letter and the hearing were the most compressed and relentless of Elena's life, and her life had included a 6-hour solo labor and 9 days of NICU vigil, so the bar was not a low one. Clara's network moved her twice more during that period, not because of direct threats, but because protocol required location rotation on a scheduled basis, and Elena's had stopped questioning protocol. She moved when May said to move. She established routines in each new location that were designed to give Marco stability within the same blanket, same songs, same sequence of events before sleep, because babies need pattern more than place. And Elena had enough nursing knowledge about early development to build pattern out of the materials available. She video called Nicholas every 3 days. She spoke with Vivian twice a week. She worked on the presentation of her testimony for the hearing with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, annotating the evidence, preparing for questions she anticipated being asked, understanding that the courtroom was a performance that required a specific kind of preparation, not falsification, but clarity. The ability to say precisely what was true in a way that a judge could hear it. She thought about Vittorio more than she expected to. Not with longing that was over, had been over before she walked out the door, but with a specific kind of attention that she couldn't quite name. The way you think about a place where something significant happened to you. Not wanting to go back, just aware of the coordinates. She thought about Marco growing up and asking, at some age she couldn't yet predict, about his father. What she would say. She had not resolved that. She knew what she wouldn't say. She wouldn't fabricate a better version than the real one. But the real one was complicated in ways that a child's question wouldn't be, and she was going to have to find a way to give a true answer, in a form that a growing person could carry, without being crushed by it. She didn't have that answer yet. She was 41 days out from the penthouse when she got the call from Nicholas that made everything shift again. He wants to meet, Nicholas said. Elena was standing in the kitchens of a safe house in upstate New York, the 4th location in 6 weeks, feeding Marco in his high chair, scraping pureed sweet potato off the tray with the focused patience that feeding a 7-month-old required. She stopped scraping. What? Vittorio. He contacted Webb, who contacted me. He's requesting a meeting. Not through attorneys directly. The two of you in a neutral location before the hearing. A pause. He says he has something to say that isn't part of the legal proceeding. Personal. Elena set the spoon down on the tray. Marco immediately tried to pick it up. "He doesn't have a right to that," she said. "No, he doesn't." "You're under no obligation. I told Webb exactly that." Another pause. "But I wanted to tell you it happened, because it's information." She took the spoon back from Marco. He protested this with his full available vocabulary. "What do your instincts say?" she asked Nicholas. "My instincts are a lawyer's instincts, which means I distrust anything that doesn't happen in a monitored record. A beat. But I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes people say things that need to be said outside the record. Whether this is one of those times, I genuinely don't know." She looked at Marco, who had moved on from the spoon controversy, and was now pressing his palm into the sweet potato with the focused interest of a scientist examining an interesting material. "Tell Webb no meeting before the hearing," she said. "If Vittorio has something to say that isn't part of the legal proceeding, he can say it after. When there's a court order in place, and I have standing that he can't maneuver around. That's my recommendation too. Then that's the answer." She ended the call and wiped Marco's hands with a cloth and thought about Vittorio in his penthouse, making the decision to ask for a meeting. The specific quality of that decision, what it cost a man like him to ask for something directly rather than engineer a situation where he could take it, was not lost on her. She recognized it as a shift of some kind. She just didn't know yet what kind. 3 weeks before the hearing, the federal indictment landed. It was a Tuesday morning. Elena was on the phone with Vivian when Nicholas's message came through, and the charges were substantial. Wire fraud, money laundering, RICO conspiracy. 8 counts total. Webb issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated and factually unfounded, which was the statement attorneys issued when they had no better statement to issue. By afternoon, it was on the news. Elena didn't watch the coverage. She had May turn the television off, and she took Marco for a walk around the property, a fenced yard behind the safe house. Brown November grass and gray sky, Marco bundled in the carrier against her chest, heavy and warm. She walked the perimeter of the yard twice and breathed cold air and thought about nothing specific, which was something she had learned to do when the specific got too dense. When she came back inside, there was a message from Vivian. "Saw the news. How are you?" She wrote back, processing. "We'll call tonight." She wrote back, "I'm okay, actually okay." She thought, actually okay. Not because Vittorio's indictment was satisfying, it wasn't. Quite. Not because the legal machinery grinding forward meant the hearing would be easy, it wouldn't be. But because she had spent the last 6 weeks being afraid of what came next, and now the next thing had come, and she was still standing in it, and Marco was warm against her chest, and the yard was cold and still and entirely manageable. The hearing was on a Thursday in December. Elena arrived at the Manhattan Family Courthouse with Nicholas at 8:45 a.m. She had not been in the city since she left it, and it hit her differently than she expected, not like homecoming and not quite like foreign territory. More like a place she had known very well and now knew differently. The way you know a street after something significant has happened on it. She wore gray, a structured blazer, dark trousers, her mother's pearl earrings. She had her hair pulled back. She looked like what she was, a competent professional woman with specific things to say and the documentation to support them. Vittorio was already in the corridor outside the courtroom when she arrived. She had known he would be. She had prepared herself for it. And yet, when she turned to the corner and saw him standing 20 feet away, the preparation and the reality were different in the specific way that preparation and reality always are. He looked diminished, was the first thing she thought. Not physically, he was still the same broad-shouldered, dark-haired man he had always been. But something in his posture had changed. The particular authority that used to come off him, the way heat comes off a surface, that was different now. Reduced. He looked like a man carrying weight he hadn't previously had to carry, which she supposed he was. He saw her. He didn't move toward her, he just looked at her. For a moment that lasted longer than it should have, given that they were standing in a courthouse corridor with attorneys and clerks moving around them, and a bailiff near the door, who was watching the corridor with the professionally detached attention of someone who had seen a great many people look at each other this way. Elena held his gaze for exactly as long as she chose to. Then she looked at Nicholas, who was beside her, and said, "Let's go in." They went in. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Elena had expected it to be brutal. It was, in places, Webb pushed back on the admissibility of several pieces of evidence, challenged the characterization of the custody strategy documents as coercive rather than precautionary, argued that the federal indictment was an independent matter that should not bear on family court proceedings. The judge, a woman named Hartwell, 60-something, with short gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had heard a great many people attempt to reframe their behavior as something more palatable, listened to all of it with an expression that gave nothing away, and wrote notes that no one on either side could see. Vivian testified for 40 minutes. She was precise and specific and devastating in the way of a witness who has been in medicine for 30 years and understands exactly what coercive control looks like when it is systematically applied to someone in a vulnerable position. She described what she had observed of Elena during the pregnancy and the weeks after Marco's birth, the exhaustion, the isolation, the way Elena had moved around Vittorio, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that certain behaviors provoked certain responses. She used clinical language when it clarified and plain language when it was more effective, and Webb's cross-examination did not significantly damage her testimony because her testimony was simply true, and the truth of it was visible to anyone in the room who was paying attention. Elena testified for 90 minutes. She was calm. She had prepared for calm the way she prepared for 12-hour shifts, not by suppressing what she felt, but by deciding in advance how she was going to manage it. She answered every question directly. She did not editorialize. When Webb pressed her on whether she had accessed Vittorio's private communications without permission, she said yes, she had, and then she explained precisely why, and the why made the yes significantly less useful to Webb than he had hoped. Vittorio did not testify. That was Webb's strategic decision, and it was the right one, putting Vittorio on the stand with the federal indictment active, and the financial records in evidence would have created exposure that extended well beyond the family court proceeding. But the absence of his testimony meant the courtroom version of events was substantially shaped by Elena's, which shaped things in directions he couldn't correct from his seat. He sat at the defense table for 4 hours and 20 minutes and watched the proceedings with the stillness he used when he was in a situation that required containment rather than action, and Elena, from the witness stand and then from her seat beside Nicholas, was aware of him in the way you are aware of weather, not focused on it, but calibrated to it. When Hartwell called a recess at 2 p.m. and indicated she would issue her ruling from the bench, after a short break, everyone in the room understood that the break was not about the judge needing time. Hartwell had heard enough. The ruling was already formed. The break was procedural courtesy. In the corridor, Vittorio found Elena standing near a window at the far end, while Nicholas spoke with the clerk near the courtroom door. She heard him coming. The specific rhythm of his footsteps was something she had lived with for 2 years, and the body remembered things the conscious mind sometimes decided not to. She turned. He stopped 6 feet away, far enough to be clear that he wasn't crowding her, close enough to talk without being overheard. "I'm not going to ask you to hear me out," he said. His voice was different. Not softer, exactly. Quieter. The difference between a man who is choosing his volume and a man who no longer has the energy to project. "I know you don't owe me that." She said nothing. "What I did, the custody plan, the surveillance. What I was planning to do," he stopped. His jaw tightened. "I told myself it was about keeping Marco safe, that it was about having control over something that mattered." He looked at her steadily. "But that wasn't it. It was about control for its own sake." "I understand that now." He paused. "For what it's worth." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "It's not worth much," she said. "Not cruelly, just accurately. Understanding something after you've already done it isn't the same as not doing it." "I know. Marco is going to grow up," she said. "He's going to be old enough to ask questions. I don't know what I'm going to tell him about you yet. I'm not there." She held his gaze. "But I'm not planning to make you a villain in his life. That's not something I'm interested in doing." She paused. "What I am going to do is make sure he's safe, and if that requires a judge to put limits on your access to him, then that's what it requires." Vittorio absorbed that. He looked at the window for a moment at the street below, the gray December light, the ordinary Manhattan traffic moving past a courthouse where the shape of access to his son was being decided. "The hearing," he said. "Whatever Hartwell decides, I'm not going to fight it the way I would have 3 months ago. I want you to know that. Your attorney fighting it is the same as you fighting it." I told Webb this morning to stop pursuing aggressive litigation on the custody matter. A pause. There's still the federal case. That's going to be long. But on Marco, I'm not going to drag this into something that takes years and destroys everything around him in the process. He met her eyes. I don't know if that changes anything for you. She looked at him at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago, at the particular way a person carries the weight of understanding they've gotten something badly wrong and there isn't a mechanism to undo it. She recognized it because she had studied human faces in extremity for 12 years, and what she saw was real, which didn't make it sufficient, but made it real. It changes the temperature of the next decade, she said finally. That's not nothing. She turned and walked back toward Nicholas before he could respond. Nicholas glanced at her as she reached him. You okay? Yes. She straightened the lapel of her blazer. Let's go back in. The bailiff opened the courtroom door. They went back in. Judge Hartwell returned to the bench at 2:31 p.m. She arranged her papers with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and for whom ceremony was a tool rather than a comfort. She looked at both tables. She looked at her notes. Then she looked up. I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties in this proceeding, she said, and I find the record both extensive and, in several respects, deeply troubling. She paused. The room was completely still. The documents introduced by the petitioner establish a pattern of behavior that this court takes seriously specifically, the preparation of materials designed to build a legal case against the respondent's parental fitness, the engagement of private surveillance of the respondent, and the management of financial assets in ways that would have materially disadvantaged the respondent in any subsequent proceedings. She set her pen down. This court does not view the petitioner's departure from the marital home as an act requiring legal censure. It views it as a response to a documented pattern of coercive behavior. Webb's pen had stopped moving. Vittorio was completely still. With respect to custody, Hartwell continued, this court is granting primary physical and legal custody of the minor child Marco Kane to the respondent Elena Moretti Kane. She turned a page. The petitioner will have supervised visitation at a schedule to be determined by a family mediator with a review hearing in 12 months, at which point the court will assess whether the nature of that supervision requires modification. She paused. The court is also ordering financial restitution in the amount she named a figure that was significant but not punitive, payable to the respondent within 90 days. She looked up from her papers. The court is aware that the petitioner faces separate federal proceedings. This court makes no ruling with respect to those proceedings, but notes for the record that the minor child's welfare is the court's primary concern, and that the stability of the child's environment is best served by the arrangement this court has outlined. She paused one final time. This ruling is effective immediately. She gathered her papers. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Elena exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for longer than the last 4 hours, longer than the 6 weeks of safe houses, longer perhaps than she could accurately calculate. She felt Nicholas's hand briefly on her arm, the specific professional version of reassurance. She didn't look at Vittorio's table. She looked straight ahead at the courtroom's front wall, at the institutional wood paneling and the seal mounted above the bench, and she breathed and she thought about Marco in the care of Ruth at the Philadelphia safe house, 50 miles away, eating something with his hands and probably making a thorough mess of it. She was going to see him in 3 hours. She was going to put her son to bed in a place that was safe, under a ruling that protected him, on the other side of the thing she had been walking toward since the night she sat in Vittorio Kane's office chair and read what he had planned to do to her. She stood. Nicholas was already organizing papers. She stood in the courtroom as people began to move around her clerk's attorneys, the bailiff, the particular organized dispersal of a court session concluding, and she felt the weight of the last 6 weeks in her body, which was different from thinking about it. Her hands weren't shaking, she noticed that. She was somewhere past the point where her hands would shake. And across the room, at the defense table, Vittorio Kane sat completely still, while Webb leaned in to speak to him in a low voice, and Vittorio looked at his hands on the table, and something in the set of his face was not defeat exactly. Defeat was a simpler thing, but something older and more complicated, the expression of a man who has arrived, through significant wreckage, at the beginning of understanding what he actually should have done. Elena picked up her coat from the chair beside her. She put it on. She looked at the courtroom one more time, at the bench, the seal, the winter light coming through the high windows. And then she walked toward the door, and Nicholas fell into step beside her, and she pushed through into the corridor, and the cold air of the hallway hit her face, and she kept walking. The door swung shut behind her. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. She drove to Philadelphia herself. Nicholas had offered to take her, but she had said no, not sharply, just clearly, the way she said things now that she had stopped apologizing for what she needed. She borrowed May's car, a sensible four-door with a car seat already installed in the back, and she drove the 50 miles from Manhattan to the safe house in a specific kind of silence that was not emptiness, but its opposite. The full silence of someone who has just come through something significant and hasn't yet decided what to do with the other side of it. The December light was gone by the time she reached the house. Ruth opened the door before Elena reached the porch, which meant she had been watching for the headlights, and behind Ruth, somewhere in the warm interior, Elena could hear Marco not crying, just the particular insistent vocalizing of a 7-month-old who had opinions about his current situation and was communicating them to anyone within range. Elena walked through the door, and Ruth stepped aside, and Elena found Marco in the portable playpen in the living room, sitting upright with the focused concentration of someone who had recently mastered sitting and was still somewhat amazed by it. He looked up when she walked in. His face, that open, uncalculating face, moved through something she had no word for except recognition, the specific recognition of a baby for the person who was his fixed point. He reached for her. She picked him up and held him against her shoulder and stood in the middle of Ruth's living room and felt him grip her collar with both fists, and she did not cry, which surprised her a little. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something settle, a physical settling, like when a structure that has been under lateral pressure finally has the pressure removed and finds its own plumb again. He ate well, Ruth said from the doorway. Sweet potato and some of the pear thing. He threw most of the pear thing, but I think he ate some. That's consistent, Elena said. Ruth made tea without asking, and Elena sat on the couch with Marco in her lap and drank it while Marco systematically examined each of her fingers with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. Outside, the December night was cold and still and ordinary. Inside, the radiator clicked, and the tea was too hot, and Marco's grip on her index finger was stronger than it had any right to be given that he weighed 18 pounds. She stayed the night at the safe house. She called Nicholas and told him the ruling had settled in. She called Vivian, and they talked for 40 minutes, not about the case specifically, but around it, about what came next. About Oregon, about the medical technology company that had offered Elena a remote consulting position 6 months ago that she had put on hold and was now ready to pick back up. Vivian asked how she felt, and Elena thought about it genuinely before answering, which Vivian appreciated. Like, I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, Elena said, and I just set it down. And my arms still remember the weight, but my hands are free. Vivian was quiet for a moment. That's as accurate a description as I've heard, she said. They said goodnight. Elena put Marco to sleep in the portable crib beside the bed, in the room she'd used the last 2 nights she'd been here, and she lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about the drive back to Oregon, not the logistics of it, but the fact of it. The specific fact of returning to the place she had made in the 3 years since she left, the apartment with the window that faced the mountains, the neighbors who knew her name but not her history, the life she had assembled from what she'd carried out of Manhattan in a diaper bag. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. The drive back to Oregon was not direct. She stopped first in New York, not the penthouse, not that neighborhood, but the city. She had things to retrieve from a storage unit she'd rented in the first weeks after leaving, items she hadn't been able to take with her in the immediate departure, some of her nursing textbooks, photographs of her mother, a box of small things that had belonged to her apartment before she moved in with Vittorio. She spent one night in the city at a hotel near Midtown. She had dinner with Nicholas at a restaurant. He chose a quiet Italian place where the food was good and the lighting was low, and nobody knew who either of them was. They talked about the modification hearing scheduled for 12 months out, about the supervised visitation logistics, about the timeline of the federal prosecution. How long do you think the federal case takes? She asked. Nicholas considered. Criminal cases at that level 2 years, potentially. Could be longer if the defense pursues every available delay. Could be shorter if they negotiate. He cut a piece of bread. Cooperation would significantly reduce the timeline. And the sentence. Do you think he'll cooperate? Nicholas was quiet for a moment. I think Vittorio Kane is a man who built his identity around never giving anything up. Cooperation requires giving something up in a form that's witnessed and recorded. He paused. But I also think he's a man who is looking at a decade or more in federal prison and a son who will be a teenager before he's out. And that changes the arithmetic in ways that even his identity has to eventually account for. Elena nodded slowly. She hadn't asked because she wanted to predict Vittorio's choices. She had asked because Marco was going to grow up and ask her questions she needed to have thought about. If he cooperates and gets a reduced sentence, she said, the modification hearing becomes relevant in a different way. Yes, if he's out in 4 or 5 years instead of 12, he's going to petition for modification. A judge will take that seriously if he's demonstrated changed circumstances. Nicolette met her eyes. That's not a bad thing, Elena. A father who has served time, completed a sentence, and genuinely rehabilitated courts take that seriously. So do children, eventually. She looked at her plate. I know. I've thought about it. And I'm not going to fight him on modification if the circumstances warrant it. She said it flatly, without drama. I'm not interested in keeping Marco away from his father as a punishment. I'm interested in Marco being safe and having what he needs. Those are different projects. She picked up her fork. But right now what he needs is stability. And stability means Oregon. Nicholas nodded. He lifted his glass, then Oregon. She lifted hers, Oregon. She had one more thing to do before she left the city. She drove to the hospital where she had worked for 11 years, on a Tuesday morning, before the commute traffic fully thickened. She hadn't called ahead. She parked in the structure and walked through the main entrance with Marco in the carrier against her chest. And she took the elevator to the 4th floor, to labor and delivery, and she stood at the nurse's station and waited. Pam, who had been her charge nurse for 7 of those 11 years, and who had the specific density of a person who has seen everything and forgotten nothing, looked up from the desk and said, well, with a quality that encompassed an entire year's worth of unasked questions. I just wanted to come by, Elena said. Pam came around the desk. She looked at Marco with the practiced assessment of a woman who had received 10,000 newborns and knew a healthy baby when she saw one. He's good, she said. He's very good. Pam looked at Elena with the same assessment. Took in the gray blazer, the composed face, the specific quality of someone who has been through something difficult and come out of it changed but intact. You're okay, she said. Not a question. I am, Elena said. You going to come back? Elena had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she'd expected to. Not here. I'm doing consulting work, medical technology. Emergency care systems. She paused. It turns out 12 years of watching things go wrong in delivery rooms gives you useful perspective on where the systems fail. Pam made a sound that was somewhere between approval and acknowledgement. You were a good nurse, she said, which from Pam was the equivalent of a lengthy testimonial from anyone else. I know, Elena said. Pam looked at Marco one more time. Name? Marco, good name. She went back around the desk. Don't be a stranger. Elena took the elevator down and walked out of the hospital through the main entrance, the same entrance she had walked through for 11 years in every kind of exhaustion. And she stepped into the December morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, Marco warm against her chest, the city moving around her the way it always moved, the way it moved regardless of what any individual person was going through. She had come to this city at 23 with a nursing degree and very little else. She had built a life here, and then she had built a different life inside the one she'd built, and then that second life had failed, and she had found her way back to something that was more honestly hers than anything she'd lived in this city had been. She was not sad to leave. She was not glad exactly either. She was something more neutral and more permanent than either of those. She was done with this particular chapter, and done was a different country from sad. She walked to her car and put Marco in his seat and drove to the storage unit and spent 2 hours loading what she needed into the back of the rental, and then she drove to the airport and returned the car and checked in for the flight to Portland, and she did all of it with the methodical attention of someone who is no longer operating in crisis mode, which was a state she had forgotten was available to her and was relearning now, one ordinary task at a time. 3 years passed. That is the only honest way to say it, not in a single continuous motion, but in the accumulated texture of ordinary days, which is how most significant change actually happens. Not in courtrooms and safe houses and 4 a.m. departures, but in the Tuesday afternoons and the Wednesday mornings, and the 1,000 small decisions that add up eventually to a life. Asena settled in Portland. The apartment with the mountain view became, over months, a home not assembled from the remnants of the penthouse life, but built fresh, from the materials she actually wanted. Bookshelves, a good kitchen table. A corner of the second bedroom converted into a space for Marco that grew and changed as he did, from a crib to a toddler bed to a bed, with a frame she and a neighbor assembled incorrectly on a Sunday afternoon, laughing at the instructions, while Marco supervised from the floor with the critical air of someone who would have done it differently. She worked. The consulting position with the medical technology company had grown from part-time remote work into something that occupied her 3 full days a week, and had led, by the second year, to a formal role developing protocols for rural emergency care systems, specifically the gap between initial triage and specialist intervention in underserved areas, which was a problem she had watched cause preventable harm for a decade and now had both the standing and the tools to begin addressing. She was good at it, not in the way she had been good at nursing, which was physical and immediate, and tied to the specific, irreplaceable presence of one person with another person in a room. This was different, systemic, slower, the satisfaction of a thing that worked not because you were there, but because the structure you'd built was there. She liked it more than she had expected to. Marco grew. He walked at 11 months. He talked early and with considerable volume, which was a trait Elena observed without comment, and suspected was not entirely from her side of the equation. By 2, he was a compact, determined person with dark eyes that were Vittorio's and a stubbornness that might have been either of them, and an enormous investment in the structural integrity of his block towers, which he would construct with painstaking care and then knock over himself, apparently finding the destruction as satisfying as the building. The supervised visitation happened twice a month at a family mediation center in Portland, where a social worker named Dennis was present and wrote notes in a spiral-bound notebook and was consistently, professionally pleasant to everyone in the room. Vittorio flew in from New York. He had been granted supervised contact, and he used every session with the focused attention of someone who understood that each one was being observed, and also with something that Elena, watching the recordings the mediator provided, recognized as genuine. She had not wanted to recognize it as genuine. She had been prepared not to. But she had spent 12 years reading people in extremity, and what she saw in those recordings was a man who was not performing showing up, but actually showing up, which were different things she had learned to distinguish. And the difference mattered, because Marco would eventually distinguish them too. The federal case resolved in the second year. Vittorio cooperated. Elena learned this from Nicholas, who had monitored the proceedings with the professional attention of someone with a direct stake in the outcome. The cooperation had been specific and limited. He had provided information about the financial architecture of the Palermo arrangement without directly implicating individuals who would have made the remainder of his life significantly shorter. The U.S. Attorney's Office had accepted the terms. The resulting sentence was 4 years, with credit for time served during the extended pretrial period and a substantial financial penalty. Nicola called her on the morning the sentence was handed down. 4 years, he says. Elena was in her kitchen, Marco in his high chair working on a banana with the dedication he brought to most physical tasks. When does he start? Immediately. He'll be in a federal facility in New Jersey. A pause. With good behavior and program completion, he could be out in 3.5. She absorbed that. The modification hearing will become relevant in approximately 2 years, depending on timeline. I'll flag it when it's approaching. Another pause. Elena, for what it's worth the way he handled the cooperation. Webb told me off the record that Vittorio refused to implicate anyone directly. He gave the financial architecture but protected the people. That's in his world, that's not nothing. She looked at Marco, who had divided the banana into sections and was examining each with scientific interest. No, she said, it's not nothing. She paused. Thank you for telling me. She put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table and thought, for the first time in a long time, about the man at the gala who had found her standing near the bar in a dress she'd worn before and had smiled at her with a realness that she had not been wrong about. She had not been wrong about that specific thing. She had been wrong about what surrounded it, about what the realness was embedded in, about whether the man who could smile that way was capable of also building a legal file designed to take her child. He had been capable of both. People usually were. That was the thing she had spent the last 3 years making her peace with, not excusing it, not minimizing it, just accepting it as the actual shape of what she had been inside, rather than the shape she had constructed to make it bearable. The healthcare summit in New York was in Marco's 3rd year. Elena's company sent her. She was presenting on the rural emergency care protocols at a panel on systemic gaps in critical care delivery, which was the kind of professional acknowledgement that would have seemed abstractly theoretical 3 years ago, and now felt like a natural consequence of doing the work consistently and well. She flew to New York with the specific relationship to the city she had developed since leaving it, not avoidance, not nostalgia, but the clear-eyed recognition of a place where significant things had happened and which was now simply a place she traveled to for work, like any other. The summit was at a hotel in Midtown. The panel went well. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes, which she had trained herself to do over 2 years of public presentations, and the questions from the audience were substantive, and her answers were grounded. And afterward, 3 people approached her with cards, and one of them was a department head at a hospital systems in Seattle who suggested a conversation about a potential partnership that she filed away to pursue. She was at the reception afterward, holding a glass of sparkling water. The specific symmetry of that detail did not escape her when she saw him. Vittorio was across the room. She understood in the first second that she had not fully prepared for this, which was unusual for her. She had prepared for most things in the last 3 years with considerable thoroughness, but she had not prepared for the specific experience of seeing him in a room she was also in, moving through a professional context, looking changed. He was thinner, not dramatically but perceptibly. He had the particular quality of someone who had spent time in a constrained environment and had used it for something, not defeat, but a kind of reduction to essentials that occasionally happened to people who had been stripped of the infrastructure they'd used to define themselves. He was wearing a suit that was good but not exceptional, which was different from how he used to dress, and he was talking to a man Elena didn't recognize. And then he looked up and across the room and found her eyes with the immediate, precise recognition of someone who had been aware of her the moment she walked in and had been deciding for the last few minutes what to do about it. He crossed the room. She held her ground. He stopped in front of her. Close enough to talk, not crowding her. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I'm presenting medical technology." She kept her voice level. "I heard you were out 2 months ago." He held her gaze. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before, not age exactly, more the specific marking of years that had been difficult in a particular way. "You look well." "I am well." She paused. "Marco's well." In case that's the next question. Something moved across his face. "I know. I saw him last week." A pause. He talked about a caterpillar he found in the yard for most of the session. Dennis seemed as interested as he was. She almost smiled at that. She didn't quite, but it was close. "He's very committed to invertebrates at the moment," she said. "We have 4 library books about insects," he told me. Vittorio looked at her steadily. "Elena," she waited. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I've changed in ways that make up for what I did. I know better than that." His voice was quiet and completely direct, in a way she associated now with people who had spent time in places where pretense was not useful. "What I'm going to say is that I understand now what I was doing to you. Not in the abstract. In the specific. Every choice I made, what it was designed to do, what it cost you." He paused. "I understand it clearly. I understood it in a room in New Jersey with 4 years of time to understand it, and there's nothing I can do with that understanding except carry it." She looked at him for a long moment. The room moved around them, the murmur of the reception, the clink of glasses, the particular ambient noise of professionals being professional at each other. Outside the high windows, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan did, entirely indifferent to the conversation happening inside. "I believe you understand it," she said finally. "That's different from it not having happened. I know. Marco is going to ask me questions someday that I'm going to answer honestly. I won't protect you from the honest version." She held his gaze. But I'm also not going to make him carry something that's ours and not his. Whatever happened between us is ours. What he needs from each of us is different from that. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. The modification petition, he said. I filed last month. She knew. Nicholas had flagged it. I know. I'm not going to fight hard for it. I'm asking for expanded supervised contact, not unsupervised. I know I'm not, he stopped. I know where I am in this. I know what I have to earn, he held her gaze. I just want him to know me. Whatever version of knowing is appropriate for right now. I'll take whatever version that is. She thought about the recordings from the mediation center. Marco's small, focused face turned toward Vittorio's voice. The way Vittorio had, in the second year of session, started bringing things not toys or gifts, but things. A leaf he'd described finding on the walk from the subway. A photograph of a dog he'd passed. Small things that required no reciprocity, that asked nothing, that were simply an offering of attention. She had watched those recordings 3 times. Talk to Nicholas, she said. He manages the legal piece. I'm not going to oppose reasonable expanded supervised if the evaluator recommends it. Something in Vittorio's face shifted, not relief exactly, or not only relief. Something more complicated that she didn't need to name. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. Be consistent. Show up every time, do the work. She looked at him evenly. That's all that matters to him. Not who you used to be, not what you used to have. Whether you show up, he nodded once. I know. She picked up her glass from the table beside her. I have people to talk to, she said, not unkindly. Just finally. He stepped back, of course. She walked back toward the group near the window where the Seattle department head was standing, and she did not look back, and she did not need to, because she was not walking away from something anymore. She hadn't been walking away from something for quite a while now. She flew back to Portland the next morning on the first flight out, which put her home by noon. The neighbor across the hall, a retired teacher named Barbara, who had become, over 3 years, the closest thing to family that Elena had built in Oregon, had Marco. Elena collected him from Barbara's apartment, which smelled like coffee and the specific comfortable disorder of a home that had been lived in by someone who cared more about living than about order. Marco was sitting on Barbara's kitchen floor with a collection of plastic animals, narrating something to himself in the half-language that 3-year-olds use when they have a clear internal story and sufficient external vocabulary to gesture at it. He looked up when Elena came in. Mama, hey buddy. He stood and came to her with the particular locomotion of a toddler, in a hurry, slightly forward-leaning, arms out for counterbalance, and she picked him up, and he wrapped his legs around her waist and his arms around her neck, and she held him in Barbara's kitchen doorway and breathed. How was New York? Barbara asked from behind the coffee maker. Fine, Elena said. Good, actually. Did you see him? Barbara knew the outline. Not everything, but enough. Elena had not planned to tell her and had told her anyway, over a bottle of wine one evening in Elena's kitchen when Marco was asleep and the mountain was turning pink in the last light, because the weight of the story was one she had been carrying alone for a long time, and Barbara was the kind of person who could hold weight without being crushed by it or altered by it. Briefly, Elena said, at the reception. Barbara looked at her with the specific attention of someone deciding whether to ask more. She decided not to. Coffee? Please. She sat at Barbara's kitchen table with Marco in her lap, and Barbara poured coffee, and Marco went back to his plastic animals, using Elena's knee as a stable surface for a giraffe who apparently needed somewhere to stand. And the afternoon light came through Barbara's window in the particular angle of a December afternoon in the Pacific Northwest, which was different from December light in Manhattan in ways that Elena had cataloged without meaning to. She drank her coffee. She thought about the summit presentation, the Seattle contact, the rural emergency care system she had spent 2 years building from the ground up, which was now operating in 14 counties across 3 states and had already documented 11 cases where the protocol had narrowed the gap between initial triage and specialist intervention by enough to change outcomes. 11 cases. 11 people who were alive or recovered in ways they might not have been. She thought about Marco, who was 3 years old, and had dark eyes and an enormous commitment to invertebrates and a block tower philosophy that found equal value in construction and destruction, and who had never once asked why their apartment didn't look like the pictures she had of the penthouse, because he had no frame of reference for the penthouse, because this was simply home. She thought about Vittorio's, somewhere in New York, making his way through a city that had known him as powerful, and now knew him as something more complicated and less easy to define. She did not think about him with softness or with bitterness. Both of those felt finished. She thought about him with the specific clarity she had developed for all the complicated things in her life, the recognition that people contain contradictions that do not resolve, and that the contradictions in someone who had hurt you do not cease to exist simply because the hurt is real. He had done what he had done. He had also, in that room in New Jersey over 4 years, apparently done some version of the reckoning that people sometimes do when they are stripped of everything they used to avoid it. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and Marco would need to know both of them eventually, and she would find the words when the time came, because she had found words for harder things. She set her cup down. Marco held up the giraffe. "He needs a house," Marco said, with the specificity of someone identifying a practical problem that requires a practical solution. "He does," Elena agreed. "What kind?" Marco considered this with genuine seriousness. He looked at the giraffe. He looked at his collection of animals on the floor. He looked at Elena with Vittorio's eyes and Elena's stubbornness, and something that was entirely his own, something clear and uncomplicated, and not yet marked by the weight of the story he had been born into the middle of. "A tall one," he said. "Because his neck. That's very logical," Elena said. She set him on the floor and got down beside him, and they began to build a giraffe house out of Barbara's coasters and a hardback book and 2 coffee mugs that Barbara sacrificed to the project without complaint. And the December afternoon light moved slowly across the kitchen floor, and outside, Portland did what Portland did in December, which was to be gray and wet, and entirely itself, and inside, a 3-year-old narrated the structural requirements of a home for a plastic giraffe to a woman who had walked out of a Manhattan penthouse with a diaper bag and her grandmother's blanket and had built, from those materials and everything she found afterward, a life that was unglamorous and unguarded and completely, irrevocably hers. The giraffe house was structurally unsound. It collapsed twice. They rebuilt it both times. By the 3rd attempt, it held. Marco looked at it with the satisfaction of a person who has solved the essential problem. Elena looked at him. She didn't need anything else from this day. She had exactly what she had left to find.